the nation, a uniformity which, while providing for the basic needs of states, especially the cash-strapped high courts and their district judiciaries, do not operate as a sort of a constraining influence. Now, what are the major activities of Phase 3? The first, and that I want to emphasize, is the creation of digital infrastructure. Digitization is envisaged, the budget is close to 2,038 crores. Technological advancements, cloud infrastructure, cloud storage has a budget of 1,205 crores. Digital preservation, access to critical services that I'm going to be speaking of very shortly, and change management. Among other activities, you have software development, which is about 243 crores. Now, there are 24 major components in Phase 3 of the e-courts project. Out of these 24 components, the Department of Justice and the E-Committee have tentatively, I say tentatively because it's subject to discussion with all our high courts, identified 13 components where there may be a need for centralization. And why centralization? The reason for centralization, for instance, is that in the area of digitization and scanning, the Expenditure Finance Committee, while releasing the 7,200 crores to us, has made certain binding recommendations. Among those binding recommendations is that scanning and digitization must be subject to open price market discovery. We envisage that about 3,108 crore documents would be digitized at a certain per page estimation. The Expenditure Finance Committee has highlighted that perhaps if you were to scale up and subject your digitization estimates to open market discovery mechanisms, the price per page will radically reduce. Now, the need therefore for this is that we need to have a centralized national agency. I'm conscious of the fact that several high courts have already begun the process of digitization. So when we have a uniform national agency, some of the best market players in India who are involved in the process of digitization across India, we'll have to take into account the work of digitization which has already been done, whether it be Odisha or Delhi or Karnataka or Kerala. The idea is not to obliterate the work of digitization, but take into now account the work which has been done and then look to the future. So apart from the fact that you have digitization and scanning which has to be subject to open market discovery of pricing, it is important to look at certain other areas as well. The digital infrastructure which we intend to create, and which is my next slide, is firstly paperless courts, second virtual courts. Delhi has been leading from the front in the creation of virtual courts, particularly in the area of traffic challans, of which we heard a short while ago. The footprint of the paperless courts has to be expanded. Live streaming, which is dependent on a robust cloud infrastructure. Today, most high courts are doing live streaming on YouTube with the attendant problems which we have been hearing in the earlier part of this presentation this morning by Chief Justice Muralidhar and by Justice Rajesh Bindal. You have these little clips about a judge in the Patna High Court asking an IAS officer as to why he was not appropriately dressed in a suit as opposed to being dressed in only a shirt and a trouser. Or somebody in the Gujarat High Court saying something about, why a lawyer is not ready with her cases. So a lot of funny stuff is going on the YouTube, which we need to control. Because this is serious stuff. What happens in the court is extremely serious stuff. Live streaming that we are doing has a flip side. We as judges need to be trained ourselves because we are now working in the age of social media. Every word which we say in the court is up on the public realm, which we realize when we are hearing the Constitution bench arguments. Very often citizens don't realize that what you say in the course of a hearing of a case is to open up a dialogue. It doesn't reflect what you're going to ultimately decide necessarily in every case. In some cases it may, in some cases it may not. But people don't understand this at large. So live streaming, our interface with social media, places new demands on us as judges. But therefore, we need to create a robust cloud infrastructure for live streaming. And cloud infrastructure perhaps is one way where we have to have a national model, a centralized national cloud infrastructure, not in terms just of price discovery, but of upscaling our activities. We'll also have to have additional hardware for new courts, renewable energy. The next important area which I want to emphasize is the technological advancements which the Phase 3 document envisages. And this will refer to software development, the use of artificial intelligence, blockchain, and digital accessibility. We are conscious of the fact that artificial intelligence has the flip side as well. For instance, we would be very difficult and diffident in allowing artificial intelligence to tell us what sentence to hand down following a conviction in a criminal case. Many courts across the world have experimented with it. I don't think that we as judges would ever want to cede our discretion, which we exercise on sound judicial lines, in terms of sentencing policy. At the same time, artificial intelligence is replete with possibilities. It's now par for the course in a hearing in the Supreme Court to have a record of 10,000 pages, or 15,000 pages. Appeals which come to us from the specialized tribunals, like the APTEL, the Electricity Tribunal, or the Competition Commission, have huge records. How do you expect a judge to digest evidence in a statutory appeal in a record involving 15,000 pages? Artificial intelligence can prepare the entire record for you. Or, for instance, we have been using artificial intelligence for transcription of the proceedings in the Constitution bench of the Supreme Court. Simultaneously with the arguments, we have a screen in the court in which the entire oral argument is transcribed. At the end of the day, the transcript is provided to all the lawyers to clean up any errors which may have taken place. There were very funny errors which sometimes takes place. One of the arguments made by the lawyer for the petitioner was confused with the lawyer for the government of India. It was obviously cleaned up by the end of the day when the lawyers notice it, and then it is put out on the website for public consumption. But transcription is another AI-assisted activity which we are in the process of implementing. As you know, we are now launched into translation of judgments of the Supreme Court. There are about 34,000 judgments, core 34,000 judgments of the Supreme Court since independence. All of these judgments were digitized by providing an ESCR free of charge. And the idea behind this initiative, which I was pursuing since 2016, but I realized that some things can only be achieved when you become Chief Justice, because perhaps people listen to you better. I don't know what the secret to that is. Just Muralidhar is also an example of that. But what happened is that I thought that we must put out our judgments, which should be available free of charge. The private software developers provide great service. But why should it be that a citizen has to pay the kind of charges which are levied by private software developers when our law colleges are not resourced? Our lawyers in the talukas or the district courts are not resourced to pay for the software. In about 2 months after I took charge, with all the 34,000 judgments now in the form of an ESCR, but we are not stopping at that. What better way, I thought, to provide access to justice to our common citizens than providing our judgments in a language which our citizens understand. And therefore, we are now in the process of using artificial intelligence. IIT Madras, which I believe is going to be making a presentation here, is at the forefront of that activity. But we've also used our retired district judges across high courts to verify the correctness of the translation which is being made before these translated judgments are put out on the internet. The next aspect which I would like to stress on is the need for e-Seva Kendras. Now, e-Seva Kendras are a core part of our mission in phase 3. E-Seva Kendras are important because we envisage that we will set up about 4,400 e-Seva Kendras across India at a budgeted outlay of about 394 crores. Now, an area which I want to throw up for discussion and for reflection by all the colleagues today from all high courts and the CPCs. While setting up e-Seva Kendras, can we not do something and replicate a pattern similar to, say, the passport centers? This is something which was raised just the other day with me by the team from the Department of Justice. We have passport centers across India which are run by a pan-India agency. There are two critical requirements of e-Seva Kendras. First, a certain degree of uniformity. I have all these inaugurals which I'm invited for across India, and I'm always wary of the fact, is this an inaugural only to have the Chief Justice of India to come and grace that particular event? It's important for us to have uniformity in the kind of facilities which we will be providing to e-Seva Kendras. Now, if you have to have uniformity, you can scale it up. You obviously cannot have the same e-Seva Kendra for a court establishment which has, say, 5 courts, with a court establishment which has 150 courts in UP. But you must therefore have a uniformity of facilities which we will provide in e-Seva Kendras, and then scale it up depending upon the footfalls, depending upon the number of cases, depending upon the number of judges, depending upon the number of lawyers who have access to that court on a daily basis. Cloud by default is, as the next slide indicates, one of the key missions of Phase 3. In other words, all applications will have to be migrated on cloud. We must provide for a redundant and robust connectivity. We have just heard a short while ago of the serious problems of connectivity which we have across India. But the answer to that will be by having maybe one or a few agencies which will really provide for redundant connectivity. Disaster recovery, cyber security. On cyber security, I have constituted a committee. Most of the committees which I constituted during the pandemic, for instance, I constituted a committee on live streaming rules. I constituted a committee on preparing e-filing rules. We constituted a committee on an SOP for digitization. The committee on SOP for digitization was obviated by one basic aspect, namely, what happens if the technology which we adopt today becomes obsolescent? At least I grew up. Many of the young judges here may not have grown up in the same age in which I grew up, but I grew up in an area when you had these records, the long playing and the short playing records. They gave way to your cassettes with the spools, then the smaller cassettes, then the CDs. I still have a CD player, but it is absolutely redundant because nobody plays CDs anymore. What happens if the same thing happens to our digitized record? How do we ensure that this huge outlay of public funds does not become redundant? And therefore, we constituted a committee on SOP, for an SOP on digitization, of which Mr. Tatre from CDAC, who's going to speak to you, was a very integral part. All these committees have done their work, but there's one committee which is still doing its work. And that's the committee which is chaired by Justice Rajiv Shankar. Many of the others were also chaired by him. One of the committees is the Committee on Cyber Security and Data Security and Privacy. And naturally that committee is taking time because that is the most difficult part of our work. How do we ensure data security? And how do we ensure data privacy? We have opened up our APIs, our application programming interfaces, to all government departments as step 1. Recently, we shared our APIs with a governmental agency. Before we realized that government agency had put up the APIs across India for public consumption, we had to scramble and request them to pull back the APIs from the public domain because we said, look, we can't put these APIs for public consumption across India for the reason that this deals with very sensitive data of individuals, marital problems, child sexual abuse, gender violence, commercial confidences. So we are in the process of evolving a national model for data security and privacy. And the moment that is done, I think we would have achieved a very major step. On digitization, I want to highlight a few key areas. First, digitization of court records. I've already spoken about the digitization SOP. The next, which is a very important aspect of phase 3, which is establishing a judicial data preservation software, which we would need to establish for data security. The next, catering born digital data, because now what will happen is in phase 3, a lot of our data would be born digital. We would not be scanning data which was either in the paper form or scanning something which was e-file, but it will be born digital data. So how do we cater to the born digital data? And then finally, moving towards and enabling a paperless court. In the next slide, I've already referred to the e-Seva Kendras. We also need to have a robust e-filing platform. We are now on the anvil of e-filing 4.0. Video conferencing, which I've already spoken of. There's an area which I would like to refer to on video conferencing. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Department of Justice visited the Supreme Court on 2 occasions. It was in fact not a part of conventional protocol for the Supreme Court to engage with the Parliamentary Standing Committee, but I got a request from Mr. Sushil Modi, who chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee there. He very graciously asked me as to whether the Supreme Court E-Committee would be willing to engage with the Parliamentary Standing Committee. I consulted Chief Justice Ramana, who was my Chief Justice, and he said, "Brother, if you have no problem, I have no difficulty." And I engaged with a host of members of Parliament across political lines. And I can share with you that there was just a sense of awe at the work which has been done by the Indian Judiciary, particularly in the ICT area through the pandemic. And part of the reason why we were able to sustain the budget which we had planned is because of the robust support which we got from the Parliamentary Standing Committee. Thereafter, the same Parliamentary Standing Committee came to engage with the Supreme Court in its activities with NALSA, which is chaired by Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul. Now, one very important part which the Parliamentary Standing Committee made before us was this. They said that when we visited various high courts, we found that so much of the technology infrastructure which has been set up is obsolete in the sense it's not being used by the high courts at all. Screens, the computers are just put away in a portion of the court as a sort of a reminder that we used technology at some point of time in the past. And the Parliamentary Committee had a very cogent point. All these public funds which we are utilizing, does it make sense if so many high courts are just discarding the infrastructure which we have set up? Now, I explained to the Parliamentary Committee that what you see at the front end of the High Court is not all the technology that we have. The whole High Court infrastructure is running on technology. So maybe some High Courts have now disbanded the video conferencing equipment, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the infrastructure is still in place. But I've written to all Chief Justices of the High Courts, informing about these concerns and requesting them not to disband the infrastructure which we created during the pandemic. Now, most Chief Justices have written to me saying that we have so many video conferencing equipments in place in the court. The question is not about the fact that we have these video conferencing facilities in the courts. The question is, are we using them? I get a lot of PIs as Chief Justice of India in the Supreme Court of India. Lawyers across India, whether it's from the Punjab and Haryana High Court, or the Bombay High Court, or some other High Court, telling us that, well, hybrid hearings have been stopped by the High Courts. Our High Courts have just shut down hybrid hearings. I would like to appeal to our Chief Justices and to all the chairpersons of the ICT committees, please don't disband the infrastructure which we created during the pandemic. COVID-19 provided us a justification. It was an imperative. But technology is not something which was confined only to the COVID-19 pandemic. We must look beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure that the High Court Chief Justices and all of you who will go back home to your respective states will take this up further. And finally, change management, which requires capacity building, process engineering. Process engineering is something that the High Courts have still not looked at. When I was a judge of the Bombay High Court, we began a process engineering initiative for reworking our rules of court so as to re-engineer our rules of court bearing in mind the demands of technology. I believe 10 years after I left the Bombay High Court, process engineering rules have yet to be formulated. And I'm sure, I dare say, the same thing is all over the country. So process engineering cannot just be one blip on the horizon of phase 3 of the e-courts project. All of you will need to engage with your colleagues who are in the rules committee and ensure that we take this up very seriously and bring about process engineering. So many of our civil manuals, our criminal manuals, are completely geared to a different era when you had to actually serve summons on horseback or on camel. They're not geared for the technology that we are employing today. So this is something which is very key for all of you to really apply your minds to. Training of all stakeholders. The Supreme Court of India, for instance, is now ready with e-filing. Our e-filing module is completely ready. We have engaged with the bar, we have engaged with the clerks of lawyers on multiple occasions, and we are now doing the final stage. It has undergone the security audits, and we are now doing the final stage. We called it awareness. We have requested teams of lawyers, including the Bar Association, the lawyers themselves, the Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association, to come in groups, and these groups are being made aware of e-filing. We are also training the lawyers' clerks, the munshis, because for them, law courts are the source of livelihood. They can't be left behind in the march of technology. So what we are doing in the Supreme Court now is to train all stakeholders. Our next step is to identify about 10 lawyers who will now be doing all their e-filing in the electronic mode. All their filing in the electronic mode. So the idea is now to have mascots, the representative members of the bar, who will do all the filing that they are going to do in the e-filing mode before we roll it out in the near future as a mandatory form of filing. But here again, I would like to highlight just a few issues. I had a case the other day from the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, which I must share with you. When I was editing my judgment last night, I thought I must share this example with you. The NCLAT has rules which require that all filing must be by presenting the appeal at the filing counter of the NCLAT. Now, this is true about so many high courts as well, therefore I'm sharing this particular example. The issue was, when does limitation stop to run before the NCLAT? When a matter is e-filed, does limitation stop running? Or does limitation stop running only when the physical file is filed? The NCLAT came out with an office order saying that besides e-filing, you must also file your appeals in the physical mode. Now, I do believe that there can be no greater disincentive to a lawyer or a litigant than to require them that apart from e-filing, you must also file an appeal in the physical mode. If you have to file an appeal in the physical mode, the lawyer will ask you one question: why then do I have to file it in the e-filing mode at all? You might as well scan what I'm filing and then present it before your judges in the soft form. So the first thing which high courts need to do, and we've done that in the Supreme Court as well, is that we have ensured that once e-filing is implemented, there should be no requirement of physical filing. Now, obviously, the reason why a particular tribunal said that you must also file physical copies is because the judges of the tribunal were not very comfortable with e-filing. But something which I have said in my judgment, which is that the answer to our unease as judges in handling electronic files is not to burden the litigant by requiring them to file physical files. The answer is simple: just retrain ourselves. During the course of the Constitution bench, which I've been heading for the last several months, I've ensured that all my colleagues, some of them on the verge of retirement, have gone completely in the electronic mode. And I can only tell you as a mark of my appreciation for a colleague who is almost on the threshold of 65, of the eagerness with which my colleagues have gone into the electronic mode. It's all about a change in mindsets. The technology is meant for dummies. The back end of technology is not meant for dummies, but the front end of technology is really meant for you and me, people who have a basic interest in technology and the ability to use it. That's all. So this is something which I do believe is crucial to our initiative. Why should we really impose burdens? The Supreme Court of India, for instance, had a rule that even when you e-file, the Supreme Court would collect printing charges because the e-files had to be printed by the registry. Now I ask myself the question, does the government of India really depend on a few lakhs of rupees that you generate at the end of the year and deposit in the central treasury on the printing charges we collect for printing of the e-files into physical files? What a great burden on lawyers, on the litigant who has to pay for printing charges. So these are small initiatives. The reason why I thought I might get into some of these which are boring issues, but only judges will realize them, and most of us have practiced at the bar, and we realize how difficult these issues are for lawyers and for litigants. These are really low-hanging fruit which each of you need to grasp and to ensure that you deal with them so that we can then change for the better. Just a couple of other thoughts and then I'll be done with my presentation. One, that we are on the anvil as part of our next mission of integrating the ICJS, the Interoperable Criminal Justice System, and the CCTNS with the eCourts project, so that all the data in ICJS and CCTNS can also become a part of the eCourts, and which can be lifted by us, whether it is in terms of the details about the FIR, the charge sheet, the framing of charges, the evidence which is recorded, and almost everything which leads up to the final judgment in appeal. Last couple of points. One of the things which we envisage in phase 3 now is to have a project management consultant. The reason for the project management consultant whom we have proposed to appoint at a national level is that a lot of work which we are going to do in the E-Committee together with the Department of Justice, such as selection of agencies for centralized implementation or for laying down the specifications, drawing up expressions of interest, the RFP or the request of proposals. We have a few very expert officers across the country. One of them is from Madhya Pradesh, Mr. Kazi, for those of you who have interacted with him, who are experts on drawing up expressions of interest and requests for proposals. I set up within the Supreme Court a technical advisory and a procurement purchase committee. Because honestly, how does my staff in the Supreme Court, or very senior district judges from various states, draw up an EOI or RFP? These are extremely complex issues when you are asking for the submission of tenders. So we thought we must have a project management consultant as part of phase 3 who will assist us in drawing up EOIs, RFPs, drawing up specifications. Finally, we will also propose to have a digital courts technology office which will act as a central procurement agency during the course of the phase 3 of the eCourts project. I've said, as most lawyers say, finally my last 2 points, but before I finish my speech, I realized that I've forgotten 2 more points, and I hope you will give me just 2 minutes of your time, which is a new initiative which we have launched in the Supreme Court, which is iJuris. Now, iJuris is the integrated judicial upgradation and reforms on infrastructure and services. A considerable effort was spent in preparing iJuris by both Mr. Ashish Shirodonker of the NIC, who is really a mainstay of the eCourts project, and by my former Secretary General, Mr. Sanjeev Kalgaonkar, who has recently been appointed as the judge of the Madhya Pradesh High Court. If you look at iJuris, and I request all colleagues here to look at iJuris, it has a roll down and drill down feature. I have circulated iJuris to all the Chief Justices of the High Courts just a couple of weeks ago, and we have requested all High Courts to upload data on the infrastructure which is provided within the judiciary in that state. It has data on infrastructure across the spectrum, including how many women's toilets do you have? Do you have sanitary napkin dispensers in women's toilets? How many toilets for judicial officers do you have? I got a request from Mr. Kurekar, who was the Secretary General, told me one just a few weeks ago that he got a communication from a woman officer in a very important district in the state of Maharashtra saying that there's no toilet for women judicial officers and she has to use the toilet which is made available for litigants, for people who come to the court straight from the jails. How do you expect judicial officers to function? So iJurix is really a step in aid of our monitoring our infrastructure. I'm monitoring infrastructure as part of Malik Mazhar Sultan and the All India Judges Association case. We are monitoring various aspects of the district judiciary, which is extremely close to my heart. I began my career as the Chief Justice of India by saying, please let's not call the district judiciary the subordinate judiciary. They are not subordinate. But it's not only about optics, about language and technology. There's a real need for us to upgrade the infrastructure in the district judiciary. And the purpose of iJurix is to enable us to understand, both at the micro level and at a macro level, what is the state of the infrastructure across our judiciaries, whether it is in terms of hardware, it is in terms of software, it is in terms of vacancies of judicial officers. So we're using technology now, not just for day-to-day court processes, but for an overall monitoring of the infrastructure at the national level. Well, with that, I think I'm pretty much done with all that I wanted to say. We've recently launched the LGBTQ handbook. The committee was chaired by Justice Maushami Bhattacharya, who was here. We had domain experts from across India who contributed to the work of the committee. The LGBTQ handbook has already been launched last year when we had a meeting of all the ICT committees on the occasion of the Constitution Day. By the way, the last engagement of all of us with the ICT committees was not Lucknow, where I was there, but the Supreme Court of India, the Constitution Day in November 2022. Apart from the LGBTQ handbook, we are in the process now, almost on the anvil, of launching a legal glossary of gender inappropriate terms. If you read a judgment on 376, a conviction under 376, I'm sure all of you have come across phrases that the victim was ravished by the appellant. I'm sure all of you have come across phrases. She was a concubine. I'm sure I came across a bail order in an NDPS case which said, this Negro was arrested with 5 grams of cocaine. Judges do that unwittingly. I'm not saying that there's a bias hidden in our minds. And the purpose of the legal glossary is not to belittle our judiciary, but just to make ourselves aware that in the times in which we live and in the times that we are moving towards, it's important that we pay attention as much to language as we do to substance. And we have made an effort in the legal glossary to explain why is it that some words are inappropriate for use in court proceedings. I thank you very much for inviting me here, Chief Justice Muralidhar. I exceeded my time, but there's still 5 minutes time for Justice Talapatra to say his vote of thanks, and 11:30 we'll all break for coffee. I thought that we'll break at 11:15, so we'll have a 45-minute session, but it's going to be a half-an-hour session, I guess, for coffee. Thank you very much for inviting me. So many things in my mind.